Not every space story will turn your stomach and break your heart, but the space dog Laika's story will certainly leave a cloud over your head. How do we reconcile Russia's ambitious quest in the Soviet spacecraft Sputnik 2 with the sad implications of sending Laika, a symbol of forced sacrifice, into the void? When we recall the marvels of space exploration, we should never forget the sacrifices made in its pursuit, especially the involuntary lives lost. Etched in the heart of humanity is the story of Laika, a dog who died aboard the Sputnik 2 after being blasted into space by the Soviet Union space researchers who certainly knew they were sending her on a journey of no return. The heart-wrenching story of Laika, the Russian space dog, is one of both terror and anguish, symbolizing humanity's boundless curiosity alongside the ethical dilemmas of scientific progress. The reality of Laika's mission is far from what many know. Today, we will uncover the horrifying truth in the story of Laika, a small, frightened dog who was rocketed into orbit by the Soviet Union, condemning her to a horrible death, alone and terrified. On the 3rd of November 1957, barely 30 days after the Soviet Union sent the first of humanity's artificial satellites into orbit, another significant event occurred, but this time a tragic one. On this day, a rocket named Sputnik 2, which was timed to coincide with the 40th anniversary of the October Revolution, and aimed to fly twice as high as the initial Sputnik 1, took off from the Earth's surface. With high hopes and expectations of better impact, considering the experience of Sputnik 1, the spaceship was set to sail. But unlike Sputnik 1, this new mission spacecraft contained a live passenger that would never return. There were several controversies about this live passenger, starting with the name to call her. Laika was initially introduced as Kudyavka, which means little curly, but was also known as Limonchi, meaning little lemon, and later referred to as Damka, meaning little lady. A Soviet spokesman eventually clarified that her name was Laika, which means barker. The final name came when Little Miss Curly wouldn't stop barking when she was paraded on the national TV without even knowing what was coming for her. However, the name would be the least of the controversies that would trail Laika's involvement in the Sputnik 2 mission. But first, who is Laika, and how did she get entangled with the Sputnik 2 mission before being led to one of the most horrific deaths suffered by any animal? Laika was a stray dog captured on the streets of Moscow and subjected to several training sessions to prepare her for a journey of no return. Of the many stray dogs captured, Laika ended up being the chosen victim. The Soviet canine recruiters preferred female dogs for this mission because females were smaller and apparently more docile. The first test was to examine the dogs for positivity and obedience, which, unfortunately for Laika, she passed. Next, the dogs, including Laika, were made to live in tiny pressurized capsules for days and then weeks before being examined for their reactions to air pressure changes and extremely loud noises. After the rigorous and terrifying training, two potential choices emerged, which included Laika. The Soviet Union space research doctors then performed gruesome surgery on both dogs to insert several monitoring devices into their bodies. These devices are designed to help the researchers monitor the dog's vitals like blood pressure, pulse, breathing rate, and physical movements. One would think that these monitoring devices were designed to keep the dog safe and alive, but that was definitely not the case. In fact, these tests and training sessions were only the beginning of Laika's ordeal. To further adapt Laika to the weight requirement and small cabin of Sputnik 2, she was kept in a confined enclosure that was gradually reduced in size over a 20-day period. There were no details of how she was fed or other care, and one can only imagine the horror she was subjected to over this period. This cruel confinement caused Laika's overall condition to decline rapidly, including the inability to defecate and urinate. The Sputnik 2 spacecraft itself was indeed a rush project, designed and built to take off in barely 4 weeks following the launch of Sputnik 1. The narrative is simple. Laika was chosen to die. Despite several attempts by the researchers to cover up Laika's cruel treatment, one thing was certain. Her death was imminent. 3 days before the scheduled takeoff, Laika was dressed in a constricted spacesuit, looking pitiful, drained from her training, unaware of her indirect death sentence. The constricted, newly cleaned spacesuit only allowed a few inches of movement, was armed with sensors, and, most heartbreaking of all, the spacesuit was built with mental restraint. On November 3, 1957 at 5:30 p.m., the spacecraft took off, and the countdown to Laika's death started. With rapid breath and a pounding heart, Laika began her one-way journey into space, unaware of what was to come. She rode 2,000 miles above the Moscow streets she knew, overheated, cramped, terrified, and probably hungry. During the launch, her pulse shot up to 3 times higher than normal, and it was to remain that way for a long period of time. You could only wonder how the researchers expected her to survive under these conditions. But then they knew it was a suicide mission. She would never survive up there, but they deemed it a necessary sacrifice for the data collected. Due to a failure in the cooling mechanism, temperatures inside the spacecraft increased faster than planned, and after several hours, she literally cooked to death at high pressure and temperature. Laika was left all alone to involuntarily fulfill a canine suicide mission on the Soviet ship. What happened to Laika was undeniably unfortunate and inhumane. Popular opinions after the incident suggested that what happened to Laika at the hands of the Soviet researchers was morally, ethically, and spiritually wrong. Don't you agree? However, over time, researchers have tried to push the narrative that Laika was fed poison to die a painless death, and that her sacrifice made an invaluable contribution to space science. While Laika's story is etched in the hearts of many around the world, and also paved the way for more attention to animal cruelty in space research, the narrative of a painless death for her never seemed authentic. Even Oleg Gazenko, one of the lead scientists who worked with the dogs used in the space program, couldn't help but feel guilty for being part of the cruel experiment. In his words, "The more time passes, the more I'm sorry about it. We shouldn't have done it. We did not learn enough from the mission to justify the death of the dog." Another biologist involved in the Sputnik 2 launch, Adelia Kotovskaya, recalled in an interview, "I asked her to forgive us, and I even cried as I stroked her for the last time." Many people shared similar opinions and felt compelled to investigate the underlying motivations of this project that led to the sacrifice of this innocent dog. First, it was the consideration of how Sputnik 2 was a rushed project before speculators started pointing out possible political motivations in this quest. The attempt to be transparent while concealing numerous dark secrets about the involvement of Laika in the Sputnik 2 mission creates an atmosphere of doubt. First off, Sputnik 2 was not designed for a return, and all participants in the research project knew there was no chance of a return for Laika. Doctors predicted that Laika wouldn't live beyond 7 days at most, eliminating every chance of her survival. Another false narrative is the impression that Laika died a painless and stress-free death. For many years, the Soviet Union researchers sold the narrative that Laika had died painlessly from oxygen depletion, until 2002, when it was revealed that the sweet-natured and trusting dog had died from overheating, high pressure, and cramps from restricted movement. Lewis, another key player in the mission, admitted that the temperature inside the spacecraft after the 4th orbit registered over 90 degrees. There's really no expectation that she made it beyond an orbit or two after that. Using stray dogs was quite a strategic effort, because no one would have given up their pet for such an inescapable, horrific experience. Since the mission, Laika has been hailed as a superhero in the advancement of space research, particularly in the Soviet Union. But the actual question begging for an answer is, was Laika's death really worth it? Did the death contribute significantly to new or existing knowledge about space? In the end, Laika was more like collateral damage in a rushed space project than a superhero, as projected by the researchers. Although Laika's tragic death and horrifying truth that came afterwards changed the perspective of animal involvement in space research, it doesn't change Laika's experience. In 2008, almost half a century after her horrific death, Laika's statue was unveiled in Moscow as an abstract piece showing a rocket and hand blending into one, cradling Laika morphed together and pointing towards the sky. If only she had gotten as much thoughtfulness before being sent into the void, never to return. Nevertheless, as we continue to explore space, Laika's unwilling sacrifice will never be forgotten. So when you find yourself looking up at the moon or stars, find time to spare a thought for Laika, the sweet-natured canine sacrificed in the quest for space research.